Look at that shelf. A sack of cornmeal, a tin of lard, a jar of dried pintos in the back corner, half a box of saltines, a bottle of sorghum so old the label is peeling. You see an empty pantry. She saw dinner. She saw tomorrow's breakfast. 3 more days if she was careful, and she was always careful. This is not a video about poverty. This is a video about knowledge, the kind that lived in the hands of women who raised families through the worst collapse in American history and still put something hot on the table every single night. 30 meals. Let's begin. Number 30, lard biscuits with sorghum. Flour into the bowl, salt, baking powder. Cold lard cut in with 2 knives until the mixture looked like coarse sand. A splash of cold water. A quick turn. No kneading. She knew kneading made them tough, and she had learned everything the hard way so you wouldn't have to. In the Appalachian South and the Ozarks, the biscuit was the meal. Sorghum poured on top, dark, mineral, almost smoky. A 5-pound sack of flour cost 9 cents in 1933. The lard was rendered from the November hog, practically free. Grandma just called it biscuits. They were hot, golden on the bottom, soft in the middle, exactly what you needed at 5 in the morning. Number 29. Cornmeal mush, cold water in the pot, salt. Cornmeal poured in slow, stirring constantly, watching it thicken from thin gruel to something that moved like slow lava. Poured into a bowl while still hot, a spoon of lard melting into the center, maybe a pour of cane syrup down the side. A pound of cornmeal cost 3 cents in the 1930s. 3 cents fed a family of 5 at breakfast and left enough to slice cold and fry for supper. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. In 2024, a Brooklyn restaurant put this on their menu. Called it polenta. Charged $14. 3 paragraphs on the menu about a 3-cent meal. That is not progress. Number 28. Navy bean soup. Into the pot the night before, sorted, rinsed, covered with cold water to soak. By morning, twice their size. Then salt pork, a quartered onion, peppercorns. Low and slow for the better part of a day. The kitchen filled with something dense and savory and faintly sweet. The smell of something becoming more than the sum of its parts. Dried navy beans cost 5 cents a pound in 1930s New England and the rural Midwest. 1 pound, 1 2-cent piece of salt pork, a pot that fed 5 and lasted 3 days. They knew things about dried beans that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. They were not wrong. Number 27. Crackers and milk, a bowl. Cold whole milk, thick, cream-heavy, from a cow 40 feet from the back door. Saltines broken in one by one, sinking slowly. Eaten with a spoon after dark, with just the one lamp burning. In Midwest farm communities of the 1930s and 40s, this was supper. Not because they had failed. Because at the end of a long day there was nothing left to cook, and this was enough. Starch, protein, fat, calcium. It kept you through the night. This was not hunger theater. This was a family with enough, and they knew the difference between enough and nothing because they had seen nothing the silence. Around that bowl was not the silence of want. It was a day ending. Number 26. Fried salt pork and gravy. The slab came out of the brine where it had been sitting since fall, white and firm, smelling of salt and thyme. She sliced it thin, rinsed the worst of the salt off, and laid the slices into a cold cast-iron skillet. The heat came up slow. The fat began to render first, pooling in the pan, and then the edges started to curl and brown, and the smell of it, salt and pork fat getting dark in cast iron, is a smell that people who grew up with it never fully lose. When the slices were done, she left the fat in the pan, sprinkled in a handful of flour, let it brown, then poured in water slowly, stirring until gravy formed. That gravy went over biscuits. It went over cornbread. It went over boiled potatoes. It stretched one piece of salt pork, which cost 8 cents a pound in 1930s Appalachia and the Deep South, into a meal for 6. One piece of meat. A family of 6, full. That is not poverty cooking. That is understanding something about fat and protein and starch and heat that most people with fully stocked modern kitchens will never grasp, because they were never asked to. Number 25, tomato gravy. A spoon of lard or bacon grease in the pan, heated until it shimmered. A spoon of flour stirred in and cooked until it smelled nutty. Then the tomatoes, home canned from August, or a 5-cent can from the store. Poured in and stirred until the whole thing came together into something red and glossy and smelling of summer even in the middle of January. In southern Appalachia, Tennessee, Georgia, the Western Carolinas, tomato gravy over biscuits was Sunday food even when there was no Sunday food. It tasted like something had been added when in fact nothing had been added except time and attention. The acid of the tomato cut through the fat of the roux and made the whole thing seem richer than it was. Brighter, more. She understood acid and fat in a way that no culinary school ever taught, because culinary schools teach theory, and she was operating on 30 years of unbroken practice. By 1942, when the government was rationing meat and asking American families to make do, she had already been making do for a decade. Tomato gravy over biscuits was not sacrifice. It had never been sacrifice. It was just Tuesday, number 24. Potato soup, 3 ingredients. Potatoes, water, salt, sometimes an onion if there was one sitting on the back of the counter, soft at the edges but still good inside. The potatoes went in cubed, covered with cold water, cooked until they were tender enough to mash some against the side of the pot with a spoon, enough to thicken the broth without losing the chunks. Salt, pepper if the tin wasn't empty. A spoon of butter melted in at the end if it was a good week. In Irish immigrant communities and farming towns across the Midwest and in Appalachian Kentucky, potatoes were the bedrock. A 10-pound sack cost 11 cents in 1932. 11 cents bought a week of lunches, and potatoes, real potatoes, boiled in their skin and eaten with the liquid they cooked in, delivered potassium, vitamin C, vitamin B6, and enough complex carbohydrates to keep a working person fueled for hours. This was not a soup that apologized for itself. It did not dress up or pretend to be something else. It was hot, and it was starchy, and it tasted like salt and earth, and it was there when you needed it. That is enough. That has always been enough. Number 23. Pinto beans and cornbread. The beans cooked all day. That was the arrangement. You started them in the morning, and they gave you back supper. A pot of pintos, with a piece of fatback, a chopped onion, and enough water to keep them covered, sitting on the back burner of a wood stove on low heat while the day went on around them. By 5 o'clock they were done. Soft and creamy inside, the broth turned thick and dark and deeply savory, poured over a square of cornbread that had gone slightly stiff since noon. In the coal fields of eastern Kentucky, in the hollows of Tennessee, in the western Carolina mountains, this was not occasional food. This was the anchor of the week. A pound of pinto beans cost 4 cents in the 1930s. The cornmeal was 3 cents. Together they made a meal that fed a mining family for 2 days and delivered, without anyone knowing the word for it, a complete protein. The combination of corn and beans forming every essential amino acid the human body requires. Today we call it heirloom bean stew and charge $18 a plate. The beans are the same. The hunger that designed the dish is not available on the menu. Number 22. Rice and fatback. Long grain white rice cooked in water until it absorbed everything and went fluffy and dry and separate. Then the fatback, a thick piece, salt-cured, sliced and fried in a cast-iron pan until the edges crisped and the fat ran out golden, laid on top or crumbled over, with the pan grease poured over everything as sauce. That was it. That was the plate. In the South Carolina low country and across the Mississippi Delta, rice was not a side dish. It was the foundation. Sharecropper families in the 1930s ate rice and fatback 2 or 3 times a week, not because they lacked imagination, but because together these two things, the starch, the fat, the cured pork, provided the caloric density required to work the land from sunup to sundown and do it again tomorrow. A pound of white rice cost 5 cents in 1935. Fatback was 8 cents. For 13 cents, a family of 4 ate. Not ate poorly. Ate full. There is a difference, and the difference is in the hands of the person doing the cooking and the knowledge those hands carried. Number 21. Vinegar pie, the crust was lard and flour, rolled thin and laid into a pie tin. The filling, eggs beaten with sugar, a splash of apple cider vinegar, a spoon of butter, a pinch of nutmeg, baked until the custard set, trembling slightly in the middle when you pulled it from the oven, golden on top, smelling faintly sharp and faintly sweet at the same time. Left to cool on the windowsill, in the Texas hill country and across the rural South, when there was no fruit and no lemon and no luxury of any kind, vinegar pie was dessert. The acidity of the vinegar mimicked citrus in a way that surprised people who had never had it. Bright and clean against the richness of the egg custard, the lard crust shattering when you pushed a fork through it. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Restaurants in Austin and Nashville are now charging $12 a slice for what they call heritage custard pie or southern shrub tart. The recipe is, in every meaningful way, this pie. The difference is a chalkboard menu and a story about provenance. The grandmothers who made vinegar pie in the 1930s had provenance. They also had an empty fruit bowl and a bottle of vinegar and the ingenuity to turn that into something sweet. No chalkboard required. Stop here for a moment. 10 meals. 10 times someone stood in a kitchen with almost nothing and made something that worked. Not something that merely filled a stomach, something with flavor, with technique, with an understanding of how fat behaves in heat, and how acid cuts richness, and how protein and starch together make a complete meal, and how a pinch of salt and a long simmer can turn the cheapest raw material on earth into something worth sitting down for. This knowledge was not accidental. It was built over generations, passed from grandmother to mother to daughter, hand to hand, demonstrated at the stove, corrected with a quiet no, like this, accumulated across a century of necessity until it was so deep in the muscle memory of American working-class women that it didn't feel like skill anymore. It just felt like cooking. And then it was taken, not gradually, not through neglect. In the early 1950s, General Mills and Pillsbury began running national advertising campaigns with a single, clear, specific message. A woman who cooked from scratch was wasting her time. She was behind. She was not modern. She was, the ads implied, a little embarrassing. Betty Crocker, a fictional character invented by General Mills in 1921, not a real woman, a marketing invention, appeared in magazines and on radio telling American housewives that the biscuits in a box were just as good as homemade, that the cake mix was indistinguishable from scratch, that cooking from raw ingredients was a burden that modern women didn't need to carry. By 1960, scratch baking in American homes had declined by 40%. By 1970, the knowledge was no longer being passed down, not because it had been forgotten, because the industry had convinced an entire generation that remembering it was beneath them. That is not progress. That is the largest act of cultural theft in the history of American domestic life, executed with a smile and a coupon for 30 cents off. 20 more meals. Let's keep going. Number 20. Savory oatmeal with bacon grease. Not the oatmeal we think of now. Not sweet, not brown sugared, not loaded with dried fruit and a drizzle of honey in a ceramic bowl that costs $40. This oatmeal was savory. Steel-cut oats or rolled oats cooked in water with salt, a spoonful of bacon grease stirred in at the end, maybe black pepper, maybe nothing else. Heavy, dense, the kind of breakfast that sat in your chest until noon. Across the farming communities of the Midwest in the 1930s and 40s, this was working fuel. A pound of rolled oats cost 9 cents. Bacon grease cost nothing. It was saved in a tin can on the back of the stove after every batch of bacon and used for everything. The fat in the grease added calories and richness. The oats added slow-burning complex carbohydrates that metabolize over 4 to 5 hours. Together they kept a farmhand going through a morning of physical labor that no modern office worker would survive. Today, in certain Brooklyn brunch restaurants, savory oatmeal is $11. They serve it with a soft poached egg and a scatter of scallions, and they call it rustic. Grandma just called it breakfast. She made it in 12 minutes. She made it for 9 cents. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 19. Bread and butter pickles on white bread. 2 slices of white bread, buttered. Real butter, because there was always butter, because there was always a cow or a neighbor with a cow or a store that sold it for 25 cents a pound. A layer of bread and butter pickles, the homemade kind that spent the summer in a canning jar. Cucumbers sliced thin with onion, brined in vinegar and sugar and mustard seed. The smell of them when the jar opened, sharp and sweet and herby, was its own kind of anticipation. This was a sandwich with no meat. That was not an oversight. It was lunch made from what was available, and it was balanced in ways that nutritionists now call macronutrient pairing. The fat of the butter, the carbohydrate of the bread, the acidity and probiotic content of the fermented pickle. The vinegar in home-fermented pickles supported gut bacteria that the body needed. They didn't know that. They knew it tasted right. Grandma just called it lunch. There was nothing else to call it. You ate it standing up at the kitchen counter sometimes, or wrapped in a piece of wax paper and taken out to the field. It was not special. It was not a statement. It was just enough, which was all it ever needed to be. Number 18. Hoe cakes, cornmeal, and water. That is almost the entire recipe. Sometimes a pinch of salt. Sometimes a spoon of bacon grease stirred into the batter. Mixed until just combined. Thick enough to hold its shape when you spooned it into a cast iron skillet that was already hot and slick with lard. Spread flat with the back of the spoon, cooked until the edges went dry, and the bottom released clean and brown and crisp. Flipped once. Done in rural Georgia, Alabama, and across the deep South of the 1930s, a hoe cake cost under 2 cents to make. The name came from field workers, black and white, sharecroppers and day laborers, who cooked them on the flat of a garden hoe, held over an open fire during the workday, because coming in from the field for a meal was not always an option the workday allowed. That history lives in the name. Every time someone makes a hoe cake, they are doing something that people did in the Alabama sun in 1935, over a fire, with their hands, because hunger doesn't wait for a kitchen. Eaten with beans, with sorghum syrup, with nothing, still perfect either way. Number 17. Bean and potato hash, yesterday's pinto beans, whatever was left in the pot after supper, maybe a cup and a half, thick with their own cooking liquid, diced potatoes raw, cut small so they cooked fast, hot lard in a cast iron skillet. The potatoes went in first, spread flat, left alone long enough to start forming a crust. Then the beans, mashed slightly against the side of the pan, spread over the potatoes, salt, pepper. Left undisturbed for 5 minutes until the bottom went golden and crusted, and when you ran a spatula under it, it came up in one satisfying mass that was crisp on the outside and creamy underneath. In the coal mining communities of West Virginia, in the hollows of eastern Kentucky, this was what happened to beans on Wednesday. Monday you ate them straight. Tuesday you ate them with cornbread. Wednesday they became hash. Nothing left the pot until it was gone, and even then the pot got rinsed with water, and the water got used for something else. This is one of the greatest textures in American working-class cooking. The crunch of fried potato meeting the creaminess of mashed bean, and it has been completely forgotten. Not by accident, because nobody told you it existed. Number 16. Egg drop soup depression version, water in the pot. Or weak broth, the water you'd boiled potatoes in, slightly starchy and faintly savory, or water with a marrow bone if there was one left in the back of the icebox. Brought to a boil. Then 1 egg, just one, cracked into a cup, beaten lightly with a fork, poured in a thin stream into the boiling liquid while stirring slowly with a chopstick or a fork. The egg set in long, silky threads. Salt, pepper, done. 4 minutes start to finish. In immigrant neighborhoods across the Midwest in the 1930s, Italian, Eastern European, Jewish, some version of this appeared at the table when there was nothing else. 1 egg. A pot of hot water. A meal, a single egg contains 6 grams of complete protein and 13 essential vitamins and minerals, including vitamins A, D, E, B12, riboflavin, and selenium. In 1935, eggs cost 18 cents a dozen, 1.5 cents each. For 1.5 cents, a bowl of hot protein-rich soup appeared in front of a child who needed it. That is alchemy. That is knowledge disguised as simplicity. Number 15. Macaroni and tomatoes, not macaroni and cheese. Not anything close to macaroni and cheese. Elbow macaroni, 5 cents a pound, cooked in salted water, drained, mixed while still hot with home-canned tomatoes, or a 5-cent can from the store, a pinch of sugar to cut the acid, salt, maybe a little butter if the week had been a good one. Eaten hot, or left to sit and eaten cold for lunch the next day, when the pasta had absorbed the tomato liquid and the whole thing had thickened into something dense and deeply flavored. This dish appears by name in USDA Depression-era home economics relief pamphlets distributed to families in 1934. The government knew that for 10 cents, a family could eat a complete and nutritious meal. They published the recipe on a government document because the ingredients were available even in the deepest poverty, even in the states where employment had collapsed to 30%. Even in the homes where a dime was the only coin in the jar. By 1965, this dish had been replaced, in most American homes, by the blue box. The blue box costs $3 and contains orange powder. Macaroni and tomatoes contains macaroni and tomatoes. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 14. Molasses bread dark flour, water. Yeast if they had it, baking soda if they didn't, and molasses poured in from a heavy glass jar, thick and slow and black as night, smelling of iron and cane sugar and something almost medicinal. Mixed into a dense dough, baked until it came out of the oven, heavy and dark brown and steaming. with a slightly bitter, slightly sweet crust that you tore rather than sliced, and ate with butter while it was still too hot to properly hold. In New England, and through the Appalachian highlands of the 1930s, molasses was the sweetener when there was no sugar, and there was often no sugar. A quart of molasses cost 15 cents and lasted weeks. It made the bread dark and dense, and something that stuck with you in a way that refined white sugar never did. Here is the science they knew without knowing they knew it. Blackstrap molasses is one of the richest food sources of iron, calcium, and magnesium available in the natural world. 1 tablespoon provides 20% of the daily recommended iron intake. Women who baked with molasses through the Depression were protecting themselves and their children from iron deficiency anemia with a 15-cent jar of sweetener. No supplement, no prescription, just bread that tasted like the bottom of something ancient and good. Let me tell you about 1955. That year, the Kellogg Company launched a national advertising campaign with a $3 million budget, a staggering sum in 1955 dollars, specifically designed to convince American housewives that cooking hot breakfast from scratch was a burden, that standing over a pot of oatmeal or frying cornmeal mush was something that women in modern America should not have to do, that the future was in a box, on a shelf, poured from a cardboard container and ready in 30 seconds. That convenience was not a trade-off. It was freedom. By 1965, dry cereal had replaced cooked breakfast in more than 60% of American homes. A generation of children grew up eating processed grain with sugar and artificial flavoring instead of the cooked cornmeal and oatmeal and cracked wheat porridge their grandmothers had made. And those grandmothers' breakfasts, the ones dismissed as old-fashioned and burdensome, performed better by every measurable standard. A 2019 study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition compared the metabolic response to whole grain cooked porridge against ready-to-eat dry cereal in adult subjects. Cooked porridge produced sustained energy for 4 to 5 hours. Dry cereal produced a blood sugar spike followed by a crash within 90 minutes. Children who ate dry cereal were measurably hungrier by mid-morning than children who had eaten cooked grain. The grandmothers knew this. Not in the language of clinical nutrition, not in terms of glycemic index or blood glucose curves. They knew it in the language of, "This sticks to your ribs until noon." They knew it in the language of a child who made it through a school morning without falling apart at 10 o'clock. They knew it in the language of a working man who didn't need to stop and eat again until supper. The company profited. The knowledge disappeared. The children got hungry at 10, 14 more meals, number 13. Dried fruit compote, prunes, dried apricots, a handful of raisins. Whatever was at the back of the pantry shelf, shriveled and patient, waiting to be useful. Into a pot with water to cover, a stick of cinnamon, a spoon of sugar if it could be spared. Simmered low until the fruit plumped back to life, swelling into the hot liquid, the water turning amber and thick and smelling of spice and sweetness, served warm over biscuits at breakfast, or eaten cold from a bowl in the afternoon. In German and Scandinavian immigrant communities spread across the upper Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Dakotas, dried fruit compote was a winter staple. Fresh fruit was unavailable for 6 months of the year. Dried fruit, purchased in late fall for a few cents a pound, kept through January and February without refrigeration, and provided vitamins that fresh fruit, had it been available, would have provided. This was not a dessert or a garnish. This was a meal, or the fruit component of a meal, kept in the back of the pantry for when the shelf got bare. The sweetness of the prunes, the tartness of the apricots, the way they softened into the cinnamon-scented liquid. It tasted like something someone had taken care over. Someone had. The care was in the choosing and the storing and the knowing that dried fruit in February was not a compromise, it was planning. Number 12. Fried potatoes and onions, cast iron. Hot lard or bacon grease, enough to coat the pan, not enough to drown. Potatoes sliced thin, no thicker than a quarter, put in the pan in one layer, and left completely alone. That is the part most people get wrong now. They stir them, they move them. They check them every 30 seconds. You leave them alone. You let the bottom go golden and crisp before you touch them. Then the onions go in, sliced thin, sweet, layered over the potatoes. The heat turned down slightly. The lid put on to steam them soft. Salt. Pepper. One flip when everything is right. This may be the most universal pantry meal in American history. Every region, every ethnicity, every economic class that ever found themselves at the bottom of the week with potatoes and an onion. Irish immigrants in Boston, Italian immigrants in Pittsburgh, black families in Birmingham, farm families in Kansas, miners in Colorado. All of them at some point, at the end of the week or the month or the money, made this. It is still perfect. That is worth saying plainly. Fried potatoes and onions, made right, in a cast-iron skillet with enough fat and enough patience. It is still one of the best things you can cook in a kitchen. Nothing has improved it. Nothing needs to. Number 11. Water gravy. No drippings. No meat. Just flour. A couple of tablespoons shaken into a dry skillet over medium heat, stirred constantly until it darkened 2 shades and smelled faintly nutty and toasted. Then water poured in slowly, maybe a cup, maybe more, stirred without stopping as the flour absorbed the water, and the heat transformed it into something thicker than broth, and darker than expected, and smelling of nothing except warmth. Salt. Black pepper until it looked right. In the Ozarks and the rural Deep South of the 1930s, this was simply called gravy. There was no other kind most weeks. The fat was whatever was in the pan. Lard, sometimes, or nothing, if the skillet was seasoned well enough. It went over biscuits, over cornbread, over whatever was on the plate that needed something to bring it together. Water gravy is the meal at the absolute floor of the pantry. It requires flour and water, and a pan and a little knowledge of heat. That is it. That is all. And it was warm. It tasted of something, of the toasted flour, of the pepper, of the salt, and it was thick enough to feel like substance. That mattered at the end of a day when everything else was gone. Warmth matters. Substance matters. She understood that, and she made it from nothing, and it was not nothing. Number 10. Soda cracker pudding. A layer of saltines across the bottom of a bowl or a pan, not crushed, laid whole, overlapping slightly at the edges. Then cold milk poured over, just enough to cover. Then sugar scattered on top. Then another layer of crackers. Then more milk, more sugar. Left in the icebox or on the cold back porch for an hour, sometimes overnight, until the crackers had absorbed the milk completely, and the sugar had dissolved into the liquid, and the whole thing had set into something that trembled when you tilted the bowl. It was cold and slightly sweet, and the texture of the dissolved crackers was almost silky. Not crunchy, not gummy. Something in between that is genuinely difficult to describe to someone who hasn't eaten it. It was dessert from the most basic pantry shelf. Just saltines, milk, and sugar, and it tasted like something that deserved to exist. Today, icebox cake is on bakery menus at $9 a slice. The concept is identical. layered crackers or cookies softened in a liquid dairy base. The technique is indistinguishable. The execution is what the grandmothers taught, repackaged, renamed, sold back to us at a markup of several 100%. Grandma just called it pudding. She made it when there was nothing else to make for dessert, and it was good. Number 9. Cornbread crumbled in buttermilk. Yesterday's cornbread, the piece that didn't get finished at supper, left in the cast iron pan with a dish towel over it, broken into a tall glass of cold buttermilk by hand, chunk by chunk, until the glass was full and the buttermilk rose around the crumbled bread. Eaten with a long spoon, standing at the kitchen counter or sitting on the back steps, in the last of the evening light, in rural Tennessee and Kentucky of the 1930s, this was the end-of-day meal. Not a recipe, a reflex, the bottom of the pantry and the bottom of the day arriving at the same time, and this being what you made when both arrived together. Cold. Slightly tart from the buttermilk, the cornbread softening at the edges, while the inside stayed dense and grainy against the spoon. This was not the worst meal of the day. Understand that. For the people who made it, this was often the best meal, the quiet meal, the private meal, the one eaten alone, after the children were in bed and the work was done, and there was finally a moment of stillness, the buttermilk cool against the heat of the day, the taste of it clean and simple and utterly without pretense. Nothing performs in a glass of buttermilk and cornbread. Everything is exactly what it is. Number 8. Cabbage and noodles, butter in a large pan, more than seemed reasonable, a generous amount, and the cabbage, shredded fine, laid in and cooked low and slow until it wilted completely, and the edges began to caramelize and go brown and sweet and faintly nutty. This took time. 30 minutes, sometimes 40, with occasional stirring and patience that the modern cooking world has abandoned. Then the egg noodles, boiled separately and drained, added to the pan and tossed until every noodle was coated in the buttery cabbage, and the whole thing was fragrant with the sweetness of the cooked brassica and black pepper. In Czech, Polish, and Hungarian immigrant communities across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Illinois in the 1930s and 40s, this dish was called haluski. It came from Central Europe in the apron pockets of women, who crossed the Atlantic with their recipes in their heads because they couldn't take much else. A head of cabbage cost 2 cents. Egg noodles cost a nickel. The butter was from the icebox. The meal fed a family of 4. Today, haluski appears on the menu at heritage cuisine restaurants in Pittsburgh and Cleveland at $22 an entree. The menu describes it as a celebration of Eastern European culinary tradition. It is. It has always been. The grandmothers celebrating it could not have afforded the restaurant serving it.